My name's Chris, and I lead the culture practice at Brandpie, and I'm joined by my colleague Ralph. We'll be sharing some thoughts that we've been developing over the last few years and presenting what we think is quite a different way to think about organizational culture. Earlier this year, we ran some in-depth research with around 250 leaders from across the energy sector. So CEOs, CMOs, to really get a handle and an understanding of their perspective on the changing nature of the sector and the challenges that they face as an organization. And I guess no real surprises here in terms of a lot of the feedback that we heard was around the complexity and the difficulty of navigating the energy transition. But one interesting area that came out of the research we did through those conversations and through that research is that for leaders in the sector, strategic adaptation is critical to survival. And I think that's really interesting when we think about that through the lens of purpose, brand, and culture, in terms of the drive to actually start seeing changes and start to push forward to ensure that the transition becomes a reality. So I think there's been a fundamental reset in terms of organizations and leaders thinking through what is the role of our organization and what are we here for and what is the long-term value that we deliver. From a brand perspective, when we think about strategic adaptation, also this is really interesting in terms of the intent to look at brand and think about, is our brand really fit for purpose, fit for the transition that the world needs to go through? And I think what's fascinating when we look at the research is a real honesty around the role of brand today. And when we asked those 250 senior leaders about their perceptions of how the brand was performing today, almost 50% acknowledged that actually the brand is ineffective today. And that's leading to the figure that you can see on the screen in front of you. Around 98% of leaders are preparing to adapt their brand strategy, whether that's visual identity, whether that's architecture. There's a real intent to actually think through how do we shift and how do we drive our brand in a different direction to ensure that we meet the future goals. But actually, when we come to culture, we see a slightly different story. And a great quote here from Frederick, the CEO of Charge, that we used in our energy report. And Frederick makes the point that most energy companies are incredibly competent at actually defining not only their purpose, but also thinking through what are the changes needed from a brand perspective and how do we actually go about delivering that? But actually, what's stopping energy companies from becoming powerful brands is internal. So I think what we're seeing is from an external perspective, that clearly defined articulation of the purpose, that clear intent to change the brand. But actually, when we think about culture and the changes and the strategic adaptation that culture needs to go through to ensure the energy transition is met, we're not thinking about it in the same way. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. But I think one of the main reasons is that the culture is very big. It's daunting. It's complex. Where do you start? The challenge is less about defining what the culture should be, and it's more about determining how we get there. Actually defining the values and the behaviors and the culture that you're looking to build as an organization is almost not the difficult part. The difficult part is once you've defined it, how do you actually embed that within the organization so that it becomes real, so that it becomes lived by employees, and so that it actually drives the change that you need to see. The problem with culture change is culture change itself. There are three key reasons that we've picked out for this. One of the first problems with culture change is that it's not actually grounded in the real world. And a lot of what we hear is that culture change can just happen and we can go from one state to another state. And ultimately in organizations, that just does not happen because there are multiple forces pushing against that. And I think we need to embrace and realize those forces that exist. So if you think about most organizations, there are often 10 cultures on one floor. There are different cultures at Brandpie, different cultures in the design team, different cultures in the consulting team. And I think we need to be aware of that and we need to realize that and we need to play into that. So you can't just create one overarching culture because you're playing into multiple cultures within the organization. You're playing into multiple national cultures, different identities. So there has to be a more realistic starting point in terms of what we're looking to achieve. One of the other areas that we come up against time and time again when we think about organizations going through or looking to drive a culture change is just the pace of it. And if we look at a lot of the methodologies today involved in culture change, they're too slow and they're too rigid and they're too fixed. So we see organizations spending lots of time doing deep dives to analyze their culture, to build frameworks. But ultimately, by the time that you've done that, the world around us has moved on already. Your organization has moved on already. So it's too slow and it's too rigid. And by the time you've defined it, everything has changed again. And I think there has to be an acceptance that culture is always evolving. We talk about culture as a wicked problem. You can never actually solve it. One of the final areas that we observe in terms of challenges with culture change programs in terms of how they're delivered today is there's an overemphasis on leaders. There's too much focus and there's too much concentration on a very small group of people to actually define that culture and then actually cascade it throughout the organization. It exists on the ground. It's the interactions with employees, and there has to be more of a drive and an acknowledgement of the way that employees can shape culture and how we bring them into the culture change process and actually use them in a different way to spark and ignite different thinking on the ground. Ralph, I don't know if you wanted to share any thoughts.
The change is not an option, it's a mandatory. They understand a sense of destination, whether that's a purpose or an ambition or a vision. That's where they're going, and there's a commitment to make those changes. But I think the reality is that for people to take on board new cultural thinking, new cultural imperatives, new values and behaviors, they have to be co-created. And they fundamentally have to experience these changes. We're increasingly moving our thinking towards cultural interventions that allow people to experience the intent of the changes organizations are trying to make for themselves and be involved in co-creating initiatives, projects, ideas where they can feel the benefit and align that with particular business challenges that the organizations are feeling. It's really working from the bottom up through the power of experience rather than from the top down through the power of communication.
31% of employees, only 31% of employees actually, are engaged, enthused, and energized by their work. So something isn't working here. Something from a cultural perspective in terms of the environment that we're creating for people is not working from a leadership perspective, because the culture is not driving the change that the business needs to see, but it's not working on the ground either. If you look at Gallup's studies and surveys over the last 20 years or so, actually the dial on employee engagement really hasn't changed that much. That only 30% of people being engaged at work is actually pretty consistent across the last few years. We need to think radically differently about how we deliver, how we describe, and how we actually drive culture through the organization. If we think about the transition and we think about the boldness, if we think about the innovative thinking, if we think about the pushing of boundaries, that is absolutely critical to driving that transition. So why are we not thinking about that from a cultural perspective too?
We understand the need to be continually innovating our products as an asset. We understand to be continually innovating our services, continually innovating our brands. Yet we don't think about the continuous innovation of our culture. We often think about culture in a static format, but the reality is that culture isn't static. It's dynamic, it's fluid, it constantly needs to evolve and adapt. And therefore, we should be thinking about investment and approaches to the protection and progression of culture in the same way we do around brands, services, and any other asset on the balance sheet. The idea of not innovating culture is now unthinkable. And it's time to shake up culture change, and it's time to really start driving a different way of thinking about this. More hands-on, more real-time, more experimental, more co-created, and more focused on experiencing the reality of culture change and culture ideas in practice as fast as possible in organizations.
That sounds great, but what does it actually look like in reality? We wanted to provide an example of some work that we've done with AstraZeneca, and I think the challenges from a cultural perspective that organizations face are very similar. And we hear the same things regardless if we're talking to clients in the energy sector, the healthcare sector, the tech sector, etc. So AstraZeneca had a really bold vision that sat at the heart of their organization. And that vision was, we push the boundaries of science to deliver life-changing medicines. And wrapped up in that were values around being entrepreneurial, around playing to win. So very much a kind of drive to be the innovator. AZ absolutely needed to push the boundaries to develop the life-changing medicines that would impact millions of patients around the world. And that was the vision that sat at the heart of the organization. But actually, the cultural reality was very, very different. And if you listen to employees, the cultural reality on the ground was one that was slow, it was siloed, it was bureaucratic, there was lots of red tape. And comments from employees such as, how can I possibly push the boundaries of science when I'm wading through emails all day? So the question from a AstraZeneca perspective really that we were posed with was, well, if employees are wading through emails each day and they do have their hands tied behind their back, how do we actually mobilize 60,000 employees to create a simpler, a more efficient, and a more productive business so that ultimately 60,000 people can push the boundaries of science to deliver life-changing medicines? So the first thing that we actually did was we just listened. So it's very easy, I think, to actually go down a rabbit hole again in terms of framework, in terms of theory, but it was most important that we just listen to employees. So we have a platform that we use called Vitals, which enables us to engage with employees at scale very, very quickly. And in 2 weeks, we'd run 3 Vital sessions and we'd listen to 300 people. And all we did was to say, well, if you've said that the culture is slow and siloed and bureaucratic, let's get really specific. Let's understand what that really means in terms of the day-to-day. So one list of pain points from 300 people that they felt were holding them back from being able to deliver on the vision. And it was incredibly, I think, cathartic, first off, for people to actually feel listened to. But I think one of the big challenges from a cultural perspective that organizations often face is there can be a lot of listening, but then not so much action that actually follows that up. So having listened to employees and understood where the pain points were, we acted, and we acted very, very quickly. And I think that's absolutely key when we think about this new era of cultural innovation and how we approach it. So we did 3 very, very simple things. And I think that was key as well in terms of not trying to tackle everything at once. So we knew, for example, that employees had said, I spend huge amounts of my day wading through emails that I'm CC'd into. So we worked with the central IT function to reduce the number of people that could be CC'd on emails. Such a simple change, but really symbolic in terms of getting people to change their behavior and not CC the world in. Again, really simply, people said that we're spending so much of our time in meetings. We want meetings to be shorter. So we changed the meeting room booking system. So you could book meeting rooms for 15 minutes rather than an hour. Really, really simple, but again, an initiative or an action that came from the ground up. And the third thing that we did immediately was give people presentation training. So I think very similar to the energy sector, AstraZeneca, full of people who were driven by data, very analytical, but it meant that they were giving presentations to colleagues that took a very long time to get to the point. So some simple presentation training that enabled people to make the point in meetings very, very quickly. But the other thing that we knew we needed to do was something much bigger. So if we needed to transform AstraZeneca from an organization that was somewhat slow, somewhat bureaucratic, into an organization that was nimble, that was agile, that focused on what really mattered, we had to do something big. We had to do something that really stood out and created a movement amongst employees. I wanted to do something that the organization hadn't seen or hadn't done before. We did something that grabbed the attention of the whole organization. And if the idea was around how do we create time to focus on what really matters, well, let's come up with a big idea. Let's put a challenge out to all 60,000 employees within the business to collectively think through how can we save 1 million hours. And I think it was that emotive hook, that connection to actually we're doing this for a reason. We're doing this to save time so that we can focus on what really matters. And when we looked at the impact of the million-hour challenge across the organization, it spread like wildfire throughout the business. And they actually saved 2 million hours. And I think what was so positive about this was it wasn't driven by the hands of a few people from a leadership perspective. It didn't take months and months to develop. And it was grounded in the real world as well. This wasn't a top-down mandate. This was a movement that inspired people to simplify for something much bigger in pursuit of that bigger goal. And there are actually 700 projects across nearly 100 countries that fell into this program of work, all from that really simple idea of how do we save time. And if we look at the results in terms of that 2 million hours, those 2 million hours can be repurposed for things that really, really matter. So 2 million hours can be repurposed to complete 400 more early phase trials. It can be used to achieve 26 more late phase trials. And ultimately, it can be used to improve the lives of 4 million patients. So a massively impactful piece of work that was done in a sprint style, bringing people into a different way of thinking and inspiring them to drive change on the ground.
I think one of the key points around this is, as with all innovation, you have to create demand. So we don't assume the audience. We have to create cultural interventions. We have to innovate thinking with ideas that can create demand and an appetite for involvement and engagement in the organization. The reason this idea spread like wildfire culturally is because it captured people's imagination. It was simple, it was easy to get involved, and everybody could relate it to their own everyday experience in the organization. How I save a few hours a day is completely different to how somebody in IT might. But we can all be connected by the same idea. And creating connections around the organization through culture innovation, that's the way you drive new thinking. That's the way you drive new behavior. And the more you can align a portfolio and a sequence of those cultural innovations to current and future business challenges and opportunities, you start to weave together the strategy, you start to weave together the purpose.
I'm not going to talk through kind of lean in huge amounts of detail, but this was essentially a cultural challenge that they faced around how do we get 16,000 employees to embrace and adopt a new way of working. And this was about engaging middle managers and telling them a different story and bringing them together and empowering them to have a conversation and then make changes on the ground. And again, in terms of the impact that we've seen, the work that we did with Lean saved AstraZeneca $800 million over 3 years. It saw customer satisfaction rise to over 99%. It saw lead times reduced by 30%. So again, this model of working, this way of thinking, this way of acting, that it works. And I think it drives change on the ground where it's needed most. The transition is all about being bold. The transition is all about being innovative. So let's apply different ways of thinking, different principles to the way that we approach the cultural challenges that are potentially holding us back within the organization from achieving what's possible. And if I just sum up in terms of what we've learned from all of the work that we've done with AstraZeneca in terms of some practical hints and tips that I think any organization can apply to their own cultural world, I think the big thing for us is just start somewhere. The work with AstraZeneca, I think, was so successful because we met people where they were in terms of the challenges that they faced in their day-to-day, and we listened to them. And we changed things like the emails. We changed things like the meeting room bookings. So this is absolutely about listening to people. We're always amazed by solutions that are defined and developed by a few people rather than actually listening to people on the front line.
If we start to not just assume we can inflict and enforce culture change on organizations, but we create a genuine demand in people through the power of creative thinking to get involved in initiatives and interventions and experiments, that through the process of that involvement and through their experience, they understand and actually embody the changes we're looking to make.
That's the final point we wanted to make, really. I think our observation, having worked with AstraZeneca and numerous other organizations, is organizations, you have what you need. Everybody talks about people being the greatest asset. I think we just need to think differently about how we unlock the potential that is already there. We need to think differently. We need to start somewhere. But we've seen it in terms of hopefully the case studies that we've shown and demonstrated. It's there in your business already. This just needs unlocking, and you can create a movement, and it's incredible what more you can achieve once you've done that.